Everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoterica. On this week's episode of On a Technicality, we're going to be looking at how to wire up a DB15 flight stick for Beastbuster Second Nightmare. Although it was a gun game and didn't use the traditional light gun, it actually used an XY coordinate stick for the input, so we're actually able to convert any sort of mid-90s DB15 flight stick over to control Beastbusters, which definitely helps us out. Before we get into the wiring though, if you could do us a huge favor and just go down below and hit the like and subscribe button. It takes us a lot of time and energy to produce each one of these episodes, and we really appreciate each subscription and like, so if you could do that really quick, we'd appreciate it. So taking a look at the DB15 male connector, you're going to see 15 pins in sequential order, 8 on top and 7 on the bottom, and those are the pins that we're going to be using to convert this flight stick over to work on the PCB with our schematic that we showed you in the previous episode. So when we take a look at the inside of the stick, we're going to see that we have these different button areas. It doesn't require all the buttons that this Top Gun stick provides, but you are going to use some of them. You're going to need that trigger, you're going to need a bomb button, and you're going to need a reload and start button. In this tutorial, the start and the reload button are combined just because you don't really need a fourth button for that. So what we're just going to do is check the continuity on that connector. That way we know where each pin is going to be going to. So now that we know what pin the positive end of the trigger is going to, we're going to take a look at ground because we are going to be wiring up a common ground for all the buttons that we have to push. So we're going to go ahead and just count up on that male connector and find the right pin. You're going to see me drop my probe here. This is kind of inelegant way to do it, but it is the easiest way that I found that works. You just kind of jam the probe up against that pin, hold it with one finger, and then probe the pad that you need to find. What we're going to do is create a common ground across all of the button inputs. That way we don't have to worry about having an independent pin for each ground. So we're going to find our ground pin and build that ground harness in a few shots from here. But that's what we're looking for right now, is just trying to find where ground is going to. So now that we do know where our ground pin is, I'm just going to put a little solder on this pad here so we can go ahead and solder in the positive. What we did was each cable going to the positive, we checked on the pinout, and we checked that against the schematic so we knew that everything was going where it needed to be for the schematic for Beastbusters in the tutorial that we had. So when we do get all of those positive wires wired up, we'll go ahead and check continuity on everything just so we know that we are good to go. It's always a good rule of thumb just to make sure that your continuity is checked in each stage. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to remove all the wires that aren't necessary up top that we're not using, because we are going to use those from the DB15 male connector to some of the potentiometer solder points that we need to hit. We aren't going to need them up in the stick, so we are going to just pull those back and tie them off in a little bit of a knot. That way we're able to move them out of the way while we're working on everything else. So that we have all of our positive leads wired up to the correct pins, we need to go ahead and build that common ground. So what I'm going to do here is just tin my ground wire up, and I'm going to go ahead and solder that to the highest connector that I need in the flight stick. So you're just going to see me come in here, and I'm just going to go ahead and heat that iron up against the pad and that pre-tinned lead that I have there, and that's going to be nice and snug. So what I'm doing here, it's my technique. I burn the insulation away so I can get to the bare wire on my chain. I don't know that I'd recommend it. It always works for me, but I can't exactly say it's the approved way to do it. So your mileage may vary on doing this. You may have to hit it with that lighter a few times, but you are going to be able to go ahead and remove that insulation back to get to the bare wire. Nothing broke. There is no soot or otherwise carbon on there. So I'll just go ahead and come in, hit it with the iron and solder it right down. And now we have 2 of our 3 connections for that ground chain. I'm going to go ahead and just show you there's a little bit of recess there, so I'll be able to hit that next pad, but I will test continuity just to make sure that everything is connected how I want it to be. This is, like I said before, super important. It's easier to find out you made a mistake in the moment than 10 steps having to take all your work apart. But now that I have all those grounds connected, I'll come up here and hit that ground pin. Then I'll go ahead and find out what wire that I need to solder my ground chain to. Now that I know that, I'll just go ahead and cut a little bit of insulation to protect my solder point, and I'll throw it over that wire. I'll braid them together and just give them a little bit of a twist so I know that those different strands of wire are connecting really well. Then I'll just bring in my helping hands and hit it with a little bit of solder. That way we have that soldered connection as well. Go ahead and just light that with the lighter, and then I'll go ahead and test for continuity. That way I know that I have my ground connected all the way from the topmost solder point, the ground that I need to, all the way to pin 1. I see I have continuity. Awesome. So now that we have all our buttons wired up, what we have to come and do is wire up the potentiometers as well, because everything is controlled with that X and Y coordinate. There's 3 pads on each potentiometer. There's ground, there's data, and there's plus 5 volt. The data basically gives an XY coordinate to the Beastbusters PCB. Ground is ground, and plus 5 is just these potentiometers do need power for Beastbusters. So I'll go ahead and I'll connect all those wires up. We do a common ground here as well because it grounds to a different pin compared to the buttons. The buttons go to one connector on Beastbusters, and that has its own ground. The potentiometers ground out to a different pin and a different connector on Beastbusters, so we do have to make 2 different grounds. Now that I have that ground chain completed, I'm going to go ahead and solder that yellow cable to the blue cable, because that's going to ground out on the correct pin we need for the connector going for the potentiometer ground. Same as before, we just go ahead and solder that, hit it with that little bit of tubing, and it is protected. So now that we have everything wired up, we have reassembled that stick because we're going to have to go ahead and build the female DB15 portion of the wiring harness that we were able to plug that flight stick into something that's then going to be able to plug into that Beastbusters PCB. So taking a look at the Beastbusters PCB, those 2 single row plastic connector pins in the middle are going to be where we're getting some of our inputs for that flight stick from. If you watch some of our previous tutorials, they've kind of been building up to this point, so you should know how to stuff pins in plastic connectors, and you should know how to use that screw terminal DB15 port. What we're going to do is we're going to bring part of the harness from that single connector right in the middle down into that DB15 field termination kit to wire them up for part of the stick. So the colored leads are going to be going to one part of the PCB, and the black leads are going to be going to that single connector that we just saw, because there are 2 different inputs for the XY coordinates and for the buttons on the controller. And here's our finished harness minus pins. We have those 2 different areas coming out of the DB15. One for the top connector and one for the bottom connector, you'll see shortly. And that marries right up to that flight stick there. So we have that perfect connection mated in, and all the wires are nice and clean on the inside of that DB15 port. What I do right before, after I put those pins on, I'll go ahead and check continuity on all of my connections. That way I know everything is hooked up where it needs to be, so there aren't going to be any surprises down the road. And now that we have that entire harness built, we did stuff the pins in one of the connectors off screen. You're able to connect your bomb, trigger, reload, and start button to that bottom large connection. And you have all the XY data from the potentiometers coming into that top harness. All you do is plug those 2 into the front of the board, bring the stick in, and mate the female to the male DB15 connection, and you have full control of Beastbusters, removing that entire giant gun from the arcade cabinet and converting it to that flight stick. Thanks so much for watching. We'll be back in 2 Fridays for the season finale of rebuilding Beastbusters Second Nightmare to work on JAMMA. We'll have some gameplay footage of it and show you that it did work. Short of that, thanks so much for watching. If you could subscribe, we really appreciate it. Otherwise, have a great weekend. Bye-bye.